Hey y'all, I'm Ash Vampire, and the video that you're going to listen to for however long that this actually ends up going on was something of an idea that I have always kind of had in the back of my brain. It's one of those things that's frequent enough in how many times I will encounter it that you kind of invariably end up thinking about it quite a lot just because you come across it so much. But recently, it has gotten to a point where it seems like it happens almost all the time. And I think for a while, I was going to make this into like a scripted video. I was going to make a scripted video about it and kind of try to talk about it rationally. Not that this isn't going to have a rational argument sense to it. It is. Again, I've thought about this rather extensively, so it's not as though I'm just going off the rails here and, ranting into the sun without any actual backing to what I'm about to say. But I tried writing a script for this, and I was just infused with so much vitriol and anger over this subject that I realized that it really can't be anything other than an unscripted rant. So let's start off. You probably know, based on the title that I've given this video, which I haven't decided yet at the time of this recording, that we're going to talk about adaptations. For the record, I don't read manga. I have never really read manga, and I never read comic books growing up either, even before, before I knew what anime was, knew what the otaku culture was. It just wasn't my thing. There have been many instances where I tried to get into reading manga, multiple different ones that I'd been recommended that I tried to pick up, and they just never really captured my attention for one reason or another. The most common one was just how quickly you burn through a volume, and how it just kind of feels like, what am I doing this for? When I could watch a show and have like a definitive begin and end point. And and the reasons that I don't read manga are very superfluous. Like I don't have a definitive reason for why I don't. I just don't prefer to do it. And this kind of goes for like reading as well. I was a big reader as a kid, but I really just don't do it all that much anymore. I find a lot more interest in the amount of creativity that has to go into the creation of a visual medium. That is not to say that either, one is more valuable than the other, obviously, but just for the record, I don't read either regular books, light novels, manga, comics, anything like that. I don't really read anymore. But let's talk a little bit about adaptations. And we're going to get around to the discussion that surrounds adaptations, because that's really what I want to get at. The idea of the adaptation is brilliant. Let's just be frank. It's a great idea, right? Because if you're a creator and you want to make something, right? Well, you obviously have to secure money to enter a production. And when you present somebody with an original idea, a lot of the success of you being able to secure the funds that you need to create that show or movie that is a completely original idea is going to be based on either your charisma or the fact that you have success behind you that someone with money can trust. Like you have a track record for creating things that are popular and will sell very well, so they're not as afraid to give you money to do something that is completely original and has no basis of market applicability. But the great thing about an adaptation is that you can go in and say, hey, look, this original piece of work has a distinct following. It is already proven to be profitable in the medium that it's already in. So why don't we make an adaptation for this? And what's even better is that just because you have a source material to work on doesn't mean that you as a creator are sort of robbed of all of your creative rights. When you're looking at a book or a manga to adapt, there's still a lot of creative integrity and creative influence that you have to insert to actually make it into something that people care about, that people value. Like, you have to, specifically for manga, you have to think about color. You have to think about the way a character moves. You have to think about how does this character sound. There's a lot of interpretation that has to happen when you're creating an adaptation, and it gives you a lot of creative freedom if you're doing that. And I say this all because I don't want to come off as though I don't like adaptations, because I do. I consider them an incredibly valuable part of where the industry for anime currently stands. It has allowed a lot of shows that probably wouldn't have gotten made if they were, anime originals to actually get off the ground, because there's, a proving behind them as, a piece of already published media that, allows them to have a modicum of success already kind of guaranteed in a market. But here's where we come to the fucking problem. Because when I am watching a show and I have a particular point that I want to make, I will write up that point either on Twitter or in Discord, one of the two. And, or even in a video. This has happened in videos as well. In any case in which I bring up a point in a medium of my own about a particular work, and it is an adaptation, almost immediately and invariably, there will be some asshat who comes in and feels the need to tell me that, oh, well, in the manga, blah, 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 blah. It happens every single goddamn time, without fail. And I just have to tell y'all, I don't give a fuck. I don't care about what the original source material did. And honestly, to even suggest that that is a valid point of, counter argument or return of conversation is damn near insulting. And now I'm gonna break into the bones of this, because it's not as though I take this stance without having backing to it, like I said at the very beginning of this recording. On the one hand, I understand that there is a value to be had in the compare and contrast style of analysis. It looks at a very specific set of ways to judge a piece. It looks, you can find a lot of ways to understand the creative staff behind something, where if you look at an adaptation, if a particular director or an animator has a particular style, because you already know what the source material looks like, it becomes far easier to spot differences where that particular animator or director has left their touch, because you've already got a basis for what it would look like in your head, and so you can see it more easily. There's a myriad of other things that you can use compare and contrast for when you're doing analysis. But the thing is it's a completely different set of points. It's a completely different thing to talk about an adaptation in terms of its relation to the source material. It's totally separate. It cannot be in the same conversation. Like, if I bring up something like Fire Force, which I have, and I make a mention of how bad it is and how it's boring and stilted and it doesn't have any sort of appeal, how its entire premise completely lacks actual narrative functionality due to what it's actually depicting, and I'm not going to go into that. Not yet. Anyway, that's not the point of this video, but I can make all of those points, and they are completely exclusive of the fact that it's an adaptation. Whatever happens in the manga does not affect my interpretation of the show. What people fail to realize, and what they seem to do, is to conflate my criticism of the show with criticism of the entirety of the work as it exists in both the show and the manga. I hate to break it to you, I'm not fucking talking about the manga, and I probably never will talk about the fucking manga. I'm here to talk about the show. Just the show. I am not interested in the compare and contrast nature of that discussion. It's a complete movement of the goalposts. I am trying to have a discussion about what exists currently in front of me in this moment, that being the anime. So why on earth would you shift the conversation into something that I have not read, that I have no interest in reading, and which is completely irrelevant to the points that I am making? A lot of the points that I have made in my tweets about the shows that I'm keeping up with this season have been about the quality of the animation, or the quality of the art, or the way that lines are delivered. That has absolutely nothing to do with the manga. It blows my mind that people seem to think that this is an okay thing to do. That they haven't realized that when you're talking about the show, you are not interested in discussing its relationship to the manga. If I wanted to talk about the manga, and if I was interested in whether or not something was bad as a result of having poor source material, or whether it was bad because the adaptation of that source material was simply failing, I would lead off with that. I wouldn't sit there and make an assumption about the show if I was trying to discern whether or not that criticism was something that you could level against both of its iterations. It makes no fucking sense. I don't fucking care. And I don't see why anybody else does either. Is there some sort of, like, reason that people feel the need to constantly compare and contrast something that is an adaptation? Like, I've already said that there's plenty of value to be gained in talking about something in compare and contrast format. But, again, that's not what I'm doing here. It's not necessary to do, because the work of the show will function completely on its own. It will have its own flaws, it will have its own strengths, and whether or not any of those come from the manga or not does not mean that the show itself can't be criticized for those without reference to the manga. I don't get it. I really, really don't get it. And it's also, like I said, it was insulting, because if you're going to come into a discussion with me about the points that I have raised about something, why would you just choose to completely ignore the points that I have made in favor of talking about the manga? Right? Like, you have completely brushed aside the topic that I am trying to discuss, and have basically told me that what I want to talk about isn't relevant, it's not important, and really isn't worth your time. So then why the fuck did you speak up? Why? It makes absolutely no sense to me, and I cannot understand why you would insert that kind of goalpost moving dialogue into a discussion about something that's completely irrelevant. And I get that there is a desire to, talk about the manga, but don't fucking do it to somebody who's trying to talk about the show, because that's not what they're there for. That's not what I'm there for. I'm not interested. I don't get it. And there's also the whole fucking problem of how, we have the term moving manga, of when we describe an adaptation as not having sort of, acquired any sort of, original creative intent, and it's just copy-pasting, the panels from the manga and inserting in between animation to allow it to actually flow as a piece of, moving media. Well, then why the fuck are you going to sit there and use the term moving manga, and then whenever somebody comes along and tries to actually criticize the show in question, if it's not moving manga, and all you want to do is fucking talk about the manga? You can't have it both ways. Like, have the discussion be about what somebody is actually asking you to have the discussion be about. God damn, help me out here. Can somebody explain to me exactly why it is that people feel the need to chime in about something that I'm not talking about? And I get, that maybe you haven't seen the show, but you have read the manga. Well, and you want to be a part of the conversation, right? Because you have some kind of knowledge of the material as a whole. I hate to break it to you, but shut the fuck up. I don't care. That's not what I'm talking about. And I don't understand why you think that I would care. The nice thing about not reading manga, for me, and again, it's not as though the manga is bad, or that, I read it because I have some sort of vendetta against manga or anything. But the nice thing about not reading it is that all of the adaptations look like anime originals to me, even though I know they're not. That's what they look like because I have no context for them. You know, like, I get to look at something like Dr. Stone or Copcraft or Fire Force or, you know, any of the other shows that are airing that are adaptations. I get to look at them and I get to judge them on their own merits, which honestly, even if you have read the manga, is what you should be fucking doing anyway. It's a completely different set of work. Because, again, you've got somebody who's come in and who's making this adaptation, and they have to insert so much of their own creative self into its construction that it has become its own thing. Based on the manga, sure. But there are so many more people, who are involved in the creation of a show that you can't talk about it under the same lens as you would talk about the manga. You just can't do it. It's interpretive, right? It's a completely different work. It's like fan fiction in a way. It's like fan fiction light, you know? It's literally just the same events, but there is something else added to it when someone else goes in and makes something out of it that turns it into a different piece of media. It becomes something entirely different and therefore needs to be judged on the grounds of it existing in and of itself. It's not as though you can't have the compare and contrast, you know, point of analysis. That's fine. But you have to reserve that for its own discussion and not insert it into a discussion that is revolving purely around how the show in question presents itself. Because it's not the manga. You can't, there is nothing that you can say about the show's quality. There's nothing you can say about how it does things, how it executes its narrative, how its characters are designed. You can't do any of that and also, you know, use the manga as a point of comparison because they are two totally different things. Now, if I were to, say, go and look at something, an adaptation that I had read the original source material for, like let's say Aragon, right? That movie is a shit movie. The book is a great book, and I would recommend it to anybody who's interested in high fantasy. But if I'm going to discuss the Aragon movie, I would have to go in and I would have to discuss it in two completely separate parts. On one hand, I would have to talk about why it fails as an adaptation. You know, what about the book made the book so good that the movie just completely lacks? That would be one part of the discussion. And it would have to be completely segmented off from the other part of the discussion, which is why this movie fails and sucks as a movie. What does it do wrong as a film on its own? Because there's no if you try to mix the two, you're going to conflate one problem with another, right? Because if you take let's look at writing, because that's something that is, you know, applicable to both forms of the work, right? If you take the writing, right, you can criticize the writing in the book all you want. You can talk about its flow, its use of, you know, run-on sentences, you know, the adjectives used, repetitiveness, you know, length of chapters, length of paragraphs, you know, gravitas from page turning, which is something you have to consider. You can talk about all of those things. You can talk about how well the characters are written, whether or not the dialogue feels consistent, you know, all of those things you can talk about when you're discussing a book. And the thing is that you can talk about a lot of those things when you're discussing the movie or the show. It doesn't matter. You can talk about the same things. You can talk about whether or not the character writing is consistent. You can talk about whether or not their plot motivations are, you know, consistent. There's so many things that you can talk about that are similar. But the thing is that as soon as you start mixing those together, you start conflating what is bad in one with what is bad in the other. And you can't do that. The argument for whether or not it's bad completely falls apart when you're trying to justify it on just the fact that it's a bad or good adaptation. Because at that point, it doesn't tell you whether or not it is a good piece of media in its own right. If I say that Fire Force is a bad show because it is a bad adaptation, that tells you absolutely nothing about the show. The show could have the most dog shit animation on the face of this fucking earth, and I could say that it is a good adaptation. You could do that. You could 100% do that. Because the quality of the show itself has absolutely nothing to do with whether or not it is adapted faithfully and well. So I guess my bigger point is, shut the fuck up when somebody's talking about a show that is an adaptation when you want to bring in points about its relation to the manga. No one cares. The only other people who care are the people who have read the manga. And honest to God, you guys have had that conversation already. Most shows that are adaptations, the manga is so far ahead of them, when they start at least, that the conversations that you want to have, you've already fucking had. And it's kind of irrelevant to the people who are trying to discuss the show. So please, for the love of God, when somebody is talking about a new show that they're watching episode by episode, and they have interesting things to say or criticisms to levy against it, do not try to shift the conversation to the manga. That is insulting to their ability to have any sort of analytical point to make about the show, for one. And also completely disregarding the fact that they're paying attention at all. And also, don't do it because that's not what they care about. Right? They are not interested. I don't think they would be interested in hearing about why it, air quotes, gets good later. Because what they're experiencing something in the now, and that's what they want to talk about. Right? Let them come to their own conclusions on whether or not it gets good over time. Because maybe it won't. You don't know. The manga has absolutely no power over whether or not the show continues to be good or bad. So, with all that said, please, keep the discussion where it belongs. Keep the discussion where somebody has asked it to be. And you'll actually end up having a discussion, instead of just having a shouting match, essentially, where you're talking past each other about completely different subjects. So, well, that's all I've got to say, and catch you on the flip side.